You just shot my kid because he was black, so should I shoot you now? Because you're stupid, she screamed, blood on her hands, eyes burning through everything in front of her. The officer flinched and stepped back, sweat pouring beneath his armor. You pulled the trigger on my flesh and blood and dragged hell down on your own heads. A glint of light flashed from the bloodstained badge Delta Force Commander Camille Hayes. The afternoon sank slowly over the southern suburbs of the city. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the trees, scattering patches across the pavement like they were stitching fading memories back together. On the steps of an old porch, Malik Jefferson sat with his legs dangling, head bent over his phone. His fingers moved across the screen, fist half lit in the dim glow. He was typing, "Mom, I'm done. Be home in 10. The message had just appeared when a faint sound in the distance made him look up. A white patrol car with blue trim rolled slowly around the corner, the silhouettes of two officers stretching across the windshield. One of them raised an eyebrow upon seeing Malik. His gaze passed over the boy's curls, then paused on his dark skin, a look that said nothing, yet made the air grow heavy. The car crept a few more yards, then braked. There was no stop sign, no emergency signal. They simply turned the car around. Malik didn't move. He noticed something shift in the corner of his eye, but didn't think it had anything to do with him until the patrol car pulled up to the curb and the door flung open. Black boots striking the sidewalk. "Hey, kid," the man's voice rang out like a command against the fading light. "Stand up. What's that in your hand?" Malik looked up startled. He hesitated, confused. The phone was still in his right hand, a silver case glinting faintly, making it harder to read in the eyes of strangers. He stood slowly, raising both hands to chest level to show he had nothing dangerous. But partly from instinct, partly out of fear of dropping it, he kept the phone in his right hand. A small misstep for him, a big enough reason for them. The other officer shouted, his voice sharp as metal quenched in water. "Drop it, hands on your head, now." The words came out not even a second after Malik stood. Malik looked at them, hands slightly shaken. He stammered, "It's just a phone," but the word phone didn't reach their ears. The officers weren't hearing him anymore. They only saw a glint of metal in the hand of a black boy standing on his porch, head down, not moving the way they expect. The silence lasted less than 3 seconds, but stretched tight like a cord about to snap. One man's finger stiffened. A soft click echoed light as breaking bone. The other officer locked eyes with Malik's hand and shouted, "He's pulling a gun." And a real gun in a real hand became the final logic in the warped system that followed. Malik did not pull a gun. Malik did not have a gun. But Malik had brown skin, and Malik held something shiny in his hand, and that was enough. The first bullet tore through his shoulder, jerking his small body backward before it crumpled to the concrete. Blood spilled hot, thick, and dark red like the soil of the Central Highlands. The phone bounced down the steps. Its screen cracked, but the message was still there. "Mom, I'm done." The gunshots echoed through the dying light, stirring a few doors. A woman rushed out from inside, screaming on instinct, but it wasn't Camille Hayes. That mother was still on her way home, just one corner away. She hadn't heard the gunfire, at least not yet, but in just a few more minutes she would see the blood. She would hear the pathetic words of an officer explaining why her son wasn't breathing, and by then she would no longer be Camille Hayes' civilian mother. She would become what they never imagined, the woman who once gave kill orders on live targets with a margin of error of half a second and never missed. But at this moment, it was still afternoon, and there was still sunlight, and there was still a boy lying on the ground, hands curled, eyes wide open, mouth stammering one last time, "It's just a phone." But no one listened, because no one here truly wanted to listen. Malik Jefferson was only 16. The boy had stood up just as he was told. But in a system where suspicious was already defined, he was no longer a person. He was a threat, a target, someone who never finished his sentence, someone without the right to let his hands shake, without the right to wonder why his gaze was reason enough to be feared. And when the sirens finally howled from the far end of the street, when other officers arrived later than the blood blooming on his shirt, the story had already begun. Not with a chase, not with a scream, but with a look. A look carried prejudice and death, and none of them knew yet the woman who would appear minutes later, the mother with footsteps heavy as stone, eyes that pierced through armor, and blood on her hands, was not coming just to scream. She was coming to prove that this spilled blood would demand something in return, and that this death was not a mistake. It was a warning, one that began with a look and would end with an answer the entire system would have to hear whether it wanted to or not. The sunlight tilted across the sidewalk, casting sharp streaks of gold over the old dark bricks, as if even the light itself sensed something was fracturing. Malik stayed still, arms raised, refusing to let go of the phone. He had just sent a message to his mother, the screen still lit, reflecting clearly in his lightly trembling palm. The young officer across from him stared at that hand. No weapon, no forward movement, but the glint from the glass was enough to trigger every defensive reflex drilled into him during training. He stepped back half a pace and shouted, voice echoing down the block, "He's pulling a gun!" There was no second warning, no effort to confirm, no look exchanged between the two officers with weapons drawn. Just a single pull of the trigger. The gunshot rang out dry and abrupt, sliced from time like a heartbeat breaking apart. Malik dropped. His thin legs gave way onto the dusty sidewalk, his head striking the corner of the step where he'd been sitting barely 5 minutes earlier. His white t-shirt turned red just over his left chest, blood spurting in fine lines, then running in slow broken streams, warm and painful. In a brief instant between life and death, Malik looked up at the sky, a sky that had once framed youthful dreams, now torn apart by sirens, pounding footsteps, and his mother's screams from behind the gate as it burst open. My son. He was only 16. Camille Hayes shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a slap to the entire system that had just declared a black teenager an official threat. She rushed in, bare hands, grasping at the air, trying to find something to hold as her son's limp body lay sprawled at her feet. But before she could kneel fully, a rough arm blocked her and shoved her away from the body. Back off. You want a bullet, too. Another officer shouted, his gun aimed straight at Camille's chest, like the only instinct he knew was to aim and fire. Camille glared at him. Her son's blood stained the hem of her shirt and the crook of her elbow from where she'd collapsed, but her eyes didn't waver, didn't break. In that moment, through blood, through gasps and fear, through the hum of the idling patrol car, she understood something more clearly than ever. They had never seen her son as human. To them, that skin was already a weapon, and anything in his hand, even a phone, could be an excuse to fire. She felt it with certainty. Her pain was never outside their expectations. They were used to deaths like this. They feared names, feared symbols, feared consequences, but they did not fear a black mother kneeling in the street screaming over her child's blood. Camille leaned in, not to attack, but to touch Malik's face. His blood was already cold. His eyes were still open. And in those eyes was something impossibly fragile, as if he still hoped his mother would pull him up and tell him it had all been a mistake. No, Malik, baby, don't go, she whispered like a prayer forced out through the sound of police boots circling. But no prayer could undo the bullet that had passed through her son's ribs. It had pierced his heart. It had severed the entire future she had built with blood, with command, with discipline, and with the hope she carried through every mission. Blood soaked the upper half of the white shirt. That red didn't haunt only a mother. It sprayed across the gloves of the officer who pulled the trigger. He looked down at the blood-stained latex and mumbled something no one could hear. But just as he reached for his radio, Camille stood up. She was no longer kneeling, no longer crawling across the pavement. She stood like she used to on the training grounds, spine straight, eyes cold, voice steady. You just killed the son of someone who taught the world's best soldiers how to keep their hands steady when they pull the trigger, and yours slipped. Both officers froze. They didn't know who she was, but her voice made their palms sweat. Camille took a step forward, eyes still locked on Malik. She knelt again and closed his eyes. One of the officers raised his radio with a shaky hand and stammered, "Ah." I think we've got a problem here. A few 100 feet away, people started to appear at the edges of the block. A middle-aged man held up his phone filming from a distance, zooming in on the image of a black woman cradling her son, blood spreading across the sidewalk like a long, jagged scar. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For a split second, everything went unnaturally still. No sirens, no shouting, just heavy breathing and Malak's half-shut eyes resting in his mother's arms. Camille didn't need to scream. Her silence was a scream in a society pretending not to hear. Her hand rested on her son's chest where the blood still clung to the fabric, then reached for the shattered phone beside his body. The screen had gone black, but she stared at it like it held the entire reason for his death, not the device itself, but the skin that held it. The sky began to shift. Gray clouds moved in slowly. A dry leaf dropped into the streak of blood still wet. The youngest officer started to tremble. He looked around. More people, more phones. A woman from a nearby car turned up her radio. A voice came through the speaker. A teenager has been shot in the west side suburbs. Police have not released a statement. Camille looked up. Her eyes no longer held tears. She had no need to cry anymore. What remained in them now was one thing only: fire. Camille Hayes knelt in the middle of the street like a statue, broken from the heart down. Malik's blood soaked through her knees, past the fabric into her skin, inking into marrow and memory. She no longer felt heat or cold, only the raw existence of a mother who had just watched her only child gunned down by men in uniform, calling it the law. Her hands, covered in blood, scraped across the rough concrete, leaving long red streaks like the outline of an old wound in history. When her fingers touched her son's neck, searching for a pulse, a breath she knew she was wasting her final seconds denying the truth. Malak was gone. He left right before her eyes in daylight in the country she once swore to defend, under the gun of those she had once been told to trust. She raised her head, blood streaking her neck and reaching the rim of her ear. Her voice broke out no longer the cry of a grieving woman, but of someone being tortured. You just shot my son. You proud of that? The question sliced the air like a razor, sharp and thin, forcing those nearby to instinctively step back even though their guns were still in hand. It wasn't just a scream. It was the first indictment issued right there on the street. No need for forensics, no need for surveillance, just wet, blood-open eyes and a heartbeat still pulsing in a mother's chest. The youngest officer clenched his weapon so tightly his knuckles turned pale. He didn't answer. His lips moved, trying to shape a reason, then his voice cracked like a child caught lying. He acted suspicious. I thought. Camille repeated, hitting each syllable like spitting back the rod of a warped instinct this system called experience. The officer couldn't meet her eyes. He turned to the older one beside him, hoping for backup, but the older man stayed silent. His eyes that had seen too many mistakes, were now empty, a cowardly witness strangled by the badge on his chest. Camille pushed herself upright. Her movements no longer those of a frantic mother, but sharp, precise, the reflex of a soldier trained to survive field missions. Blood still clung to her hands, but she didn't wipe them. She walked forward, stopping less than 2 feet from the young officer. Her voice didn't rise, but it detonated through the thick silence of fear. I've trained hundreds to pull the trigger at the right time, taught them how to read a person's eyes, how to tell the difference between threat and panic, between someone ready to kill and a kid who just texted his mom. And you shot my son by mistake. His breathing broke. His hand dropped the gun slightly. But Camille didn't back away. Her eyes didn't blink. They pierced through the pale skin washed out by guilt. What are you looking at me? I'm still here. I'm his mother, and I'm the nightmare you just called into being. Her voice cut through the air, not loud, but sharp enough to shatter every layer of defense around her. One older officer stepped back half a pace. The younger one nearly holstered his weapon, his gaze no longer full of authority but filled with fear, like he was facing something far beyond his control. Not a gun, not the blood, but a mother standing in the twilight, unapologetic for her rage. From a second-floor balcony, a phone kept recording. The young man, filming, hadn't stopped. His eyes stayed locked on the woman screaming over her son's body. Sound rose from below the drip of blood onto brick, the broken rhythm of breath, and the sound of justice ruptured by a state-issued bullet. The camera shook slightly as the filmer's hands went cold, but he kept going. And in that footage, everything would be visible. The wild eyes of a mother kneeling in her son's blood, her arms raised without surrender, and uniformed men frozen in place like ghosts who realized they'd buried the wrong body. Camille stayed where she was, unmoving. She looked up directly into the camera, her eyes cutting through the lens, through the glass screen, hitting the viewer straight on. It was a look you couldn't ignore, couldn't scroll past, couldn't watch, and then just go on with your day. A gust of wind passed through. Leaves fell, dust swirled. The smell of blood, mixed with sweat and adrenaline, clung to the air. In that moment, surrounded by earth, blood, tears, and silence, Camille was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a witness, a living record, a jagged tear across the velvet surface of America where skin color could outweigh a human life. And everything she said, the camera got it. No edits, no cuts. Just raw playback, every scream, every drop of blood, every stare. Camille stood in the middle of the blood-stained sidewalk, chest rising and falling with restrained fury. But her rage was no longer raw instinct. It had calcified and sharp as stone, cutting through every illusion wrapped around the uniforms encircling her. The men around her started moving more slowly, as if every motion had become clumsy and unnecessary. They fumbled, not because of the blood, but because the woman staring back at them looked like someone who had just read their death sentence out loud right in the street. An older officer, sweat gathering beneath the brim of his hat, glanced sideways at his partner. Another man approached from her flank, cautiously gripping her arm before reaching into the inside pocket of her jacket. Camille didn't resist. She didn't flinch. Her bloodied hand clutched Malik's shattered phone as if holding on to the last trace of him. But when the officer pulled out her wallet and opened it to check her ID, his expression froze. His eyes widened. Sweat ran down behind his ears. His finger stopped in the middle of a metal card like he'd touched a live grenade with the pin half out. There's a military badge in here," he stammered, voice shaking. "Something, Delta. Delta." The older officer leaned in, squinting. He snatched the wallet, slid the card from its plastic sleeve, held it to his face, and read each word aloud like he couldn't believe the flash of metal in his hand. Delta Force. Who the hell is she? The military ID gleamed silver background engraved with the seal of the United States Special Operations Command. Below that, in bold, read Commander Camille L. Hayes. Her signature was printed in forgery-proof ink, the red embossed seal still crisp. Everything is laminated in a shatterproof card with reinforced edges. The air turned heavier than body armor. No one moved. The same men who had screamed in her face, pointed guns at her chest, and shoved her into her son's blood now stood frozen. The older officer squinted at Camille, voice thick with disbelief. "She's actually Delta Force?" Camille turned. The sunlight cut across her face, highlighting the dried streaks of blood down her temples. She looked up, eyes like forged steel, and said slowly, each word slicing into them, "You just killed the son of someone who trained urban assault units. Congratulations." The words made one officer in the back step away, still holding his weapon, but now unsteady as if the Glock in his hand had doubled in weight. No one else spoke. Camille didn't have to say another word. The military ID had done the rest. In their world, a badge like that could halt an entire operation. And now they knew they'd pulled the trigger on the wrong person. Camille stood surrounded by men who, moments earlier, believed they had every right to shove her to the ground, call her a threat, and charge her with obstruction. But now all those words dissolved into nothing, lost in their own heavy breathing. And Camille, still standing in her son's blood, was the one in control of the entire scene. She didn't have to shout or strike. She crushed them with the very thing they worshipped most: rank and a training system they had never even dreamed of accessing. A young officer grabbed his partner's sleeve and whispered, "If she really is Delta Force, then this whole thing, we're done." The other man nodded slightly. He's locked on the badge still held by the senior officer. The sky had turned to a dull lead gray, but the chill didn't come from the weather. It came from the reality they had killed the child of someone capable of training a unit to sweep through an entire city without leaving a trace. And it hadn't happened in the dark. It happened in daylight on camera with witnesses, blood, a military ID, and the eyes of a mother who hadn't forgiven them. Camille bent down again, placing the shattered phone beside Malik's body. She wiped the blood from his lips, then laid her hand on his forehead. Her hand no longer trembled. Her mind was already sequencing actions, not for revenge, but to make this system pay in the language it understood, process proof and pain that could not be denied. She didn't need noise. She needed precision. The officers slowly backed toward their vehicles. One of them tapped his radio, voice shaking, requesting command-level backup. Subject may be high-ranking military. Confirmed civilian fatality. Scene captured on multiple cameras. On the corner, a small crowd had begun to gather. An older woman gasped at the sight of the badge in the officer's hand. "Oh my God, she's Delta Force." A middle-aged man raised his phone. "Got it. I caught the moment they found the badge. I got everything." Camille stood up. Blood still soaked through her pants' legs, still ran down her wrist, still marked the pavement behind her. But she didn't care. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ones who had killed her son. And for the first time, they understood they were no longer in charge. Now they were the ones retreating. Night fell quickly, as if the darkness itself felt compelled to cover the body lying in the street to spare the world from staring directly at the truth that had just been blown apart by a gun fired in the name of law. Malik remained where he fell, eyes closed in silence, his body slowly cooling on the blood-soaked concrete. Camille didn't move. She sat beside him, both hands resting on her knees, her dark coat stained with blood up to the shoulders. Her knees pressed against the ground, but her back held perfectly straight, cold as a blade yet to be sheathed. She didn't cry, didn't breathe hard, didn't twitch. Her eyes didn't blink, fixed on a point in space as if watching something invisible. All sound seemed drained from the block. No one dared speak. Police didn't dare move. The streetlights came on, casting a dim glow over Camille Hayes' dry, haunting stare. Then a small beep sounded. It was short, but sharp enough to make one officer spin around. Camille lowered her head slightly toward her left wrist. A black metal watch glinted faintly beneath dried blood, pulsing a weak green. It wasn't an ordinary watch. A small screen beside the dial lit up, displaying a string of military-coded symbols and a blinking icon. She tapped the face once. Just once. Every electronic signal in the vicinity immediately shifted. The police radio frequency emitted a strange hiss. A tall officer grimaced, yanked his radio from his shoulder, and shook it hard like it was broken. "Signal's gone," he muttered to the man beside him. "Radio's jammed." At the regional precinct's command center, a warning light blinked in the dispatch room. An anomaly detection system had just triggered an alert unknown signal interference on frequency 148.515, a secured military band. Within 3 minutes, a Department of Defense support outpost nearby received the signal through emergency channels. Fort Bragg, the base where elite teams once trained, a dashboard lit up with the sender's name, CMDR, Camille L. Hayes, priority level red. While command stations scrambled to trace the source, Camille remained seated in the street. One officer eyed her with suspicion. "What the hell did she just do?" he whispered. Camille didn't respond. She touched the watch, lowered her arm, and resumed her still position. Her gaze dropped to Malik's body, but something had changed. She was no longer the mother clutching her son. She had stepped back into the role of a commander, one who didn't need orders to act. And the most dangerous thing to a violent system isn't a screaming enemy. It's someone with authority waiting in silence to strike back. Across from her, an officer fumbled with his radio trying to transmit. "We've got a situation here. Regional comms are down. I repeat, we may have a military signal breach." From the corner of the street, a bystander kept filming. On his screen, Camille sat motionless, like stone, not speaking, not looking at anyone, but she was the singular point no one dared approach. There was something about the way she sat that compressed the space around her. She wasn't defensive, she wasn't screaming, but everyone nearby instinctively stepped back as if an explosion were imminent. And they weren't wrong. Camille tilted her head slightly, her voice low and sharp, like the dagger she had once trained special forces to wield. "I don't need to shout anymore. You're about to find out who you just touched." The squad leader took a breath, pulled out his personal phone, and tried to reach command. No signal. The screen turned white with the words, "Connection lost," glaring back. Sweat formed at his temples. Behind him, a young officer glanced at Camille and whispered, "She's activating something." A white, middle-aged man nearby spoke up. "I served in Iraq. That watch is a command-grade comms device. It can hit a satellite in under 30 seconds. You boys just picked a fight with the real military." Silence spread across the block. Civilians began stepping back, phones up, live streams rolling. Car headlights lit the edge of the street, forming a halo like a stage set for reckoning. Camille still didn't move. She remained rooted at the epicenter. Behind her was death. In front of her stood the system that once trained her, and now that system was listening. A wave of pings echoed through the military frequency, monitoring satellites. Emergency relay units lit up. The name Camille Hayes flashed across internal bulletins. "Cease all transmissions in the Westbrook sector. Commander Hayes has issued a priority emergency signal. Open military-level access on Channel 9A. A dispatcher murmured under his breath. "She's Alpha 7's lead instructor, granted independent combat authority." Camille looked down at her son and whispered something no one could hear. Cold wind swept down the road across her blood-stained shoulder into the space at her chest where Malik used to rest his head when he was small. But the wind didn't make her shiver. The only thing moving now was time, and Camille knew it was counting down. She had sent the signal. What needed to be known had arrived. What needed to happen was about to begin. And she would stay here in the exact place where Malik's blood had spilled to watch every man in uniform tremble. Not because of the stains on their shirts, but because they had pulled the trigger on the one person they never should have touched. From the second-floor balcony of an apartment overlooking the dimming street corner, the pale gold of streetlights merged with the brutal red of the blood pooling beneath Camille's feet, forming a color so terrifying no camera could fully capture it. But the phone in the hand of a brown-skinned student kept trembling, recording everything without missing a single frame. While the crowd below swelled with tension, he stayed still, mounted his phone to the balcony rail, and hit live stream. No cuts, no edits, just raw footage as it happened. Camille Hayes, the woman with the shoulder-length curls sitting still beside her son's body in the middle of the street. Blood, police uniforms, the trembling hands of the man who pulled the trigger, and the glint of a military badge condensed into 42 seconds. Exactly at the 18th second, Camille's scream shook the video like even the phone flinched. "You killed my son." Her voice needed no effect. It cracked from within, echoing through the screen and cutting past any viewer's emotional defenses, stopping even the most mindless scrolling. Then came the image of the Delta Force badge under a streetlight zoomed in by the student. Camille's eyes flashed. The officer holding the card visibly shook. It was a moment no one could script, a collision of grief and raw power, of tears and institution. Beneath the video, a white caption popped up. She screamed, "You killed my son." 6 words, all uppercase. Each one struck like a hammer to the brain. The first person to share it added, "Big mistake, huge." And that was the beginning of the wave. Within the first 2 hours, the clip passed 1 million views. By hour 3, it hit 3 million. It wasn't promoted, didn't carry hashtags, but spread with the urgency of a society that had shut its eyes too many times and now couldn't look away. The original live stream account at Nevin Film belonged to a journalism student who had filmed protest clips before, but never crossed 100,000 views. By morning, CNN, NBC, Reuters, and even the BC had cited him directly. At exactly 4 hours and 7 minutes after the upload, the hashtag #YouKilledMySon began trending worldwide. Alongside it was #Big Mistake, followed by mashups, furious posts, and comments that pulled no punches. "She's Delta Force and they shot her kid in broad daylight. This system is going to pay." One viral post with over 120,000 shares read, "The boy's name is Mally. She's not just a mom. She's a Special Forces trainer. You just declared war on something you don't understand." In the comment thread beneath the video, users broke down every detail: the patrol car's license plate, the officer's name tags, the audio of shouted commands, even the serial number on Camille's military ID zoomed in enhanced and matched to Department of Defense records. Everything lined up with chilling precision. What had been framed as a civilian disturbance was now clearly a fatal error, killing the son of a senior special operations officer, a woman who had trained hundreds of soldiers to act on a single nod, and now she didn't have to lift a finger. The internet was already doing it for her. The government remained silent, but its reaction was clear in how state-run media avoided saying Camille Hayes' name. Still, the heat from the clip couldn't be ignored. Every frame was turned into GIFs, memes, and illustrated drawings. A street artist in Chicago painted Camille kneeling on the sidewalk with a red caption, "She trained heroes. You shot her son." Major YouTube channels began covering the event with urgent tones. A well-known black attorney commented, "I've seen over 100 unjustified police shootings, but never one where the target was the son of a Delta Force commander. This time, no one may walk away clean." The video spawned multiple edits, a silent version, a cut focusing only on Camille's eyes staring into the camera, and one where her scream, "You killed my son," echoed like an alarm, shaking even those who had grown numb to tragedy. One user in Atlanta posted, "I don't know who she is, but the way she sat there, no gun, no words, sent chills down my spine. That's power, real power." And under every reposted version, the caption remained like a verdict stamped in digital ink, "Big mistake, huge." Camille posted nothing. She gave no statement, but the video had said everything for her. 42 seconds, no music, no filters, just blood, a scream, and the flash of a badge that now an entire city feared. They had killed the son of a woman who didn't need to fire back with bullets, but with the truth. Night fell like a dull black curtain, but not thick enough to cover the storm that had ignited after 42 seconds of truth. While the world outside reeled at the image of Camille Hayes kneeling beside her son's body, military forums, normally silent and sealed like a sunken ship, began to tremble. The first data leak didn't come from the press or any mainstream media. It appeared quietly like a dagger slid into history. A user on a special operations forum posted a short line badge, and the clip clearly says Commander, Delta Urban Force, Camille Hayes. Attached was a magnified still from the original video. Though the frame was blurred and stained with amber light, the words on the ID card were clear: United States Army, Commander Camille L. Hayes, Delta Urban Operations. That alone set off a firestorm and closed Delta Force veteran groups. A comment directly below, low in tone and razor sharp, read, "I remember that name. She's the only only one who ever taught a full CQB cycle to the West team, a legend in urban warfare. Shooting her, that's a crime. Within 3 hours, new threads exploded. Who is Camille Hayes? Is Delta Urban Force real female commander and her covert role? Old articles once buried under thousands of mainstream stories resurfaced. A 2015 feature on Military Watch reappeared, the female warrior behind urban raid training. Camille Hayes and the drills the Pentagon never talks about. The header image showed a woman in camo face, stern, standing before a tactical map embedded with city grid codes. The caption read, Delta Urban Training 3A, Commander Hayes. Another user, verified as a former intelligence officer, commented under the reposted article, I met her in Baghdad. She's not just good, she's terrifying. And when she's quiet, that's when things get most dangerous. Veterans began speaking out. They recounted training sessions where just the mention of Hayes' name would make teams dismantle mock setups to avoid psychological breakdowns. No one called her by name. They called her the one who carries the blade. Twitter didn't stay quiet. A tweet from @ValorArchives, known for military history threads, read, They didn't just shoot a kid, they shot a living legend. Attached was a screenshot from official records Camille Hayes, rank commander. Specialty, urban infiltration tactics. Experience, 17 years. Operational zones, 9. Successful missions, 34. Injury, record, 0. Final note, active. The tweet was instantly shared by top military correspondents. A female reporter in Washington reposted it with a short caption. If you've ever wondered what real power looks like when it gets cornered, this is it. Users across platforms changed profile pictures to black and white images of Camille beside the Delta Force insignia. One meme went viral, just a photo of Camille sitting on the pavement, blood dried into her shirt with the words below, You didn't break her, you woke her. Military forums were overwhelmed. An admin on Spec Ops board posted, We're temporarily locking main threads to verify records, but one thing is certain. Camille Hayes was an operational commander of Team 12 Delta. Anyone who accidentally pulls the trigger on someone like that has crossed into forbidden ground. Another veteran under the alias Juno Lead left a short line everyone understood if only they knew that woman once taught the SWAT commander who probably gave their orders. The line between grief and reverence was beginning to blur. Camille, the mother who had just lost her son, was now being thrust into the spotlight as a strategic figure. Even the government seemed unwilling to acknowledge. Some leaked reports stated her military file was classified non-public, but social media had shattered all barriers. A PDF scan of a 2018 internal memo between the Department of Defense and the CIA surfaced, bearing Camille L. Hayes' signature. The title read, Strategic Adjustments for Urban Response During Large-Scale Civil Unrest. The stamped classification, Top secret. More than 20 global military forums cited the document. An analyst in the UK commented, If a commander of that rank is trampled by her own nation's police, this isn't just a tragedy. It's a system-level implosion. A professor of defense strategy at Duke University posted, I once taught a seminar analyzing Hayes' urban warfare tactics. Now I'm watching her being pushed into a nightmare no one dares to imagine. On Reddit, a discussion thread with nearly 2,000 comments carried the title, What Happens If Delta Force Sides with Civilians? One of the top replies read, There's nothing more dangerous than someone who knows exactly how the system runs, once served it, and is now betrayed by it. Another stated, She's not seeking revenge. She's letting the nation witness the very thing she trained soldiers to handle, but this time she's living it herself. While the world kept digging into Camille Hayes' identity, she said nothing. No posts, no appearances, no statements. Yet people began to understand that her silence was what made the entire system tremble. Camille didn't need to speak to prove anything. She had already proven it in blood, the blood of her son spilled on the sidewalk, captured on civilian cameras and in plain view of the officers who still had no idea what they had just set in motion. The next morning didn't begin with weather reports or gold prices, but with a long, suffocating silence on national television. The anchor, a brown-haired woman known for her composure even while reporting on terrorism, struggled for words. She stared into the camera, took a deep breath, and said, "The woman who lost her son in the Westbrook shooting has just been confirmed as a Delta Special Operations Commander." Another pause. She looked down at the papers in front of her hands, slightly shaking, then continued, her voice lower, as if bracing for the storm sweeping through newsrooms. Camille Hayes, 43 years old, former commander of the Delta Urban Tactical Unit. Yesterday, her son, Malik Jefferson, 16 years old, was shot by police while holding a phone. From national networks to rural radio stations, the story led every broadcast. A veteran reporter in Chicago went live from the studio. They say this system never trembles from a stray bullet. But today, America is not just facing a mistake, it's a shot aimed at the heart of honor itself. From New York to San Diego, special programming cut into regular coverage to focus on a name buried deep in classified files just 24 hours earlier, Camille Hayes. At an emergency press conference, a young journalist raised his hand, first voice rising in the packed room. "Sheriff, can you confirm, did the patrol officers know the victim was the son of a Delta Force commander before they opened fire?" The room froze. Cameras turned to the man in the black uniform, gold badge on his chest, face drained of color. He glanced at his legal advisor, then shook his head slightly. "I will not comment on an ongoing investigation." It wasn't silence, but the deflection triggered a wave of public outrage. Another reporter stood immediately, pressing further. Then why did two fully armed officers shoot a teenager who had no weapon and made no clear aggressive move? The sheriff inhaled, his face stiffening. They acted based on perceived threat following risk assessment protocol. As those words hit the airwaves, social media erupted again. One Twitter user wrote, "Perceived threat, a black teen holding a phone is now a risk. They just opened fire on the son of a woman who taught entire squads how to handle real threats." A civil rights attorney posted simply, "The arrogance of authority is the greatest threat of all." CNN interrupted its usual political commentary for a live debate with three experts, a former police officer, a retired military officer, and a war correspondent. The ex-officer shook his head. Their mistake wasn't just pulling the trigger. It was not realizing who was in front of them, and more importantly, not realizing a mother kneeling over her son doesn't need a weapon to make the entire country listen. The retired officer added, "I've heard her name before. Camille isn't the type to go on TV and cry. She'll stay silent until the system collapses on its own." The war correspondent closed with a line that silenced the studio. She once wrote the manual for controlling urban riots. Now, the riot is happening with her at the center. Public outrage kept rising. Across social media platforms, the hashtag #JusticeForMalik surpassed 12 million mentions. People began redrawing Camille's face, not in uniform, but in her moment of pain and stillness, as a symbol of endurance turned into resistance. One image spread widely, Camille, sitting with her head bowed, hands stained with blood, beneath the caption, "You can shoot silence, but silence never dies." What stood out was that while the media scrambled to comment, dissect, reconstruct her file request interviews, and flood the neighborhood where it happened, Camille never appeared. No statements, no press conferences, no social media posts, and yet that very silence became the slow-burning fire that made every article and soundbite feel more hollow. They said she didn't need to speak because every action she had ever taken, every medal, every training session, every command had become the loudest loudest answer of all. She was present in the minds of millions through images, through outrage, through the way she held her silence like a strategy, not surrender. A soldier who once served under Camille wrote on Facebook, "She taught me how to stand still under crossfire, how not to lower my weapon, and now I understand why she says nothing, because she's letting the system expose itself." The top comment below with thousands of likes read, "They shot her son," but her image is the bullet tearing through the entire media machine. On the morning of the third day, while public outrage remained high, an urgent directive from the Department of Defense was sent directly to the commander of Eastern Command. The order was clear with no ambiguity. Priority protection for Camille Hayes. Alert level unit grade. Any attempts at intrusion threats, image capture, or violation of personal privacy shall be treated as national security breaches. The directive was not released to the public, but those in the field understood immediately this was a lockdown shielding an individual who had served in a sensitive capacity before the situation escalated further. In truth, Camille never asked for protection, nor did she request special treatment. But the system itself recognized she was no longer just a person, and she had become the focal point of a confrontation pushing every lever of power to the edge. Simultaneously, the Department of Justice issued a statement announcing an independent investigation into the shooting. This time, it bypassed state channels and local task forces. A joint interagency team was formed overnight under oversight from the Office of the Federal Inspector General. The statement was only one paragraph. The shooting that resulted in the death of Malik Jefferson will be reviewed under the framework of civil rights violations and excessive use of force. The Department of Justice does not tolerate any expression of racial bias in law enforcement. Below the statement was the Deputy Attorney General's signature, stamped at 4:13 a.m. News spread rapidly like arrows released from all directions. Major outlets revised headlines: Camille Hayes shielded by Pentagon, Justice Department opens independent inquiry. A subhead carried weight when the system realizes it aimed the gun in the wrong direction. On X, hundreds of posts highlighted the phrasing in bold unit gray. A top comment with tens of thousands of shares read, "When a woman makes both of the government's biggest departments react within 48 hours, she's no longer a victim, she's the centerpiece of a national reckoning." Meanwhile, the media's tone shifted. Channels that once hesitated to mention Camille's name now aired her image in full, no blur, no concealment. A primetime special replayed archival footage of her training special ops, followed by clips of her sitting in the street, blood across her clothes. The stark contrast between the military instructor and the grieving mother was so jarring that the anchor fell silent after the segment. At the White House, a press aide was overheard telling a reporter after a closed-door meeting, "We can't deny her impact. Every outlet is tracking her even though she hasn't appeared once." When asked whether the president was aware of Camille Hayes, the aide answered simply, "Yes, he's receiving continuous updates." Beneath the media frenzy, Camille remained silent. But that silence was what made the gates begin to close, not to isolate her, but to shield someone who had once lived in the shadows of strategic warfare, now pulled into daylight by blood spilled on concrete. She didn't need to draw a weapon, didn't need to speak, didn't need to prove anything, because the system, through every order, every seal, every high-level decision, had already acknowledged her worth. And for the first time in years, the government found itself siding with someone who had once stepped away from the ranks just to be a mother. But a mother who had once wielded the blade when stripped of her only child would never retreat. The system knew it, and that was why the barriers began to rise, not just to shield her, but to keep the spark from reaching the fire. The two officers directly involved in the death of Malik Jefferson were suspended the same day the Department of Justice announced an independent investigation. An internal memo was sent to the entire precinct in the early afternoon, ordering them to leave the station, surrender their badges and weapons, and be transferred to a secure facility in the southern suburbs. The police chief made no formal statement, only repeating what he had told the press earlier. "We are cooperating to ensure transparency and fairness for all sides." But the public had run out of patience for evasive language. The phrase "suspension is not justice" began appearing on signs held by protesters gathered outside police headquarters. A live stream shot by a local resident showed the vehicle transporting the two officers pulling out of the back lot. Windows blacked out as a chorus of voices shouted from both sides of the street, "Say his name, Malik Jefferson." Meanwhile, at a temporary federal legal office, Camille Hayes appeared for the first time since the incident to complete her official written statement as part of the investigation. She arrived without an attorney, no press, no special protection request. She entered the briefing room with a prepared folder, sat down and wrote for 2 straight hours in silence. When the investigator asked if she wished to make an oral statement, Camille simply shook her head. Her report was typed on plain white paper, neatly formatted, every line justified with one single sentence in bold, resting quietly between 2 paragraphs. "I do not believe a mother should have to explain her pain." Below was a clean signature, Camille L. Hayes. Though the line was never publicly spoken, it quickly spread through investigative circles and leaked out within hours. Just 3 hours after surfacing, it appeared across multiple platforms, quoted as one of the year's most devastating lines, not for its plea, but for its refusal. An article in The Atlantic wrote, "Victims are often asked to retell their pain to validate it." Camille refused. Because there was nothing left to prove, everything had already been laid bare on the sidewalk that day. A columnist at Politico observed, "When someone who trained soldiers to fight goes silent, the one sentence she leaves behind is not an accusation, it is a reckoning." On social media, an image of the written statement circulated alongside a photo of Camille at the desk. Back, straight hair pinned tight, face unreadable. Comments below went beyond support. They shared memories of pain left unheard. One user wrote, "She wrapped anger, loss, and dignity into one line. I hope when my child grows up they understand why her silence weighed more than any speech." Legally, a former federal prosecutor said on CNN, "I've never seen a primary witness refuse to speak publicly and still have this kind of impact. She just redefined the right to remain silent not as a legal strategy, but as a moral declaration." The suspension of the 2 officers did not calm the wave of public outrage, it only fueled demands for criminal prosecution. Dozens of civil rights organizations issued joint statements calling for charges of intentional homicide and systemic discrimination. Their target was not only the shooters, but the entire chain of command, the threat assessment protocols, and the ingrained culture of bias in law enforcement. A representative of the NAACP said at a press conference, "We don't want 2 scapegoats. We want the entire reaction chain exposed. They didn't shoot a child's chest. They shot into the body of a society hollowed out by prejudice." In the middle of it all, Camille remained unseen, said nothing, wrote nothing beyond that one statement. But the weight of her presence through that one line kept millions of eyes fixed on a mother who asked for no forgiveness, no justice, but left the world to face the truth it had just uncovered. The preliminary hearing took place in a closed room where wood-paneled walls were lined with thick acoustic padding, and the ceiling lights were dimmed just enough to keep tension from spilling over like a breached dam. No press, no cameras, only a quiet circle of people seated in silence, attorneys, prosecutors, representatives from the Department of Justice, the 2 suspended officers, and a single witness standing across from them all. The judge, a white man in his 40s, face set like stone, opened with a short reminder. The purpose of this session is to assess grounds for charges and scope of investigation, not to determine guilt. But the atmosphere carried the weight of a life sentence hanging over every head. The first witness was a young woman who lived in the 3rd-floor apartment where the viral video had been recorded. She wore a gray sweater, her hair tied up, eyes steady, as she looked straight at the two officers with their heads lowered. Her voice was even unshaken, neither bitter nor hesitant. I saw it clearly. The boy was sitting both hands on his thighs, right hand holding the phone. When the police got out of the car, he stood up, still holding the phone. There was nothing else. No gun. He didn't pull anything out. At that moment, a prosecutor leaned forward and asked slowly, "Are you certain?" The woman nodded. I didn't take my eyes off him for a second. He was only holding a phone. That sentence, simple as a theorem, cut through the sealed room like a cold spear driven straight into the heart of the case. The police defense attorney tried to argue that in uncertain situations, officers have the right to respond based on immediate judgment. But the second witness, an elderly man and retired service member, dismantled that point on the spot. He entered the room with slow steps, but his eyes were sharp. "I served in Mosul. I've been stalked by kids with suicide vests. But I never pulled the trigger on a child just because I didn't recognize what they were holding. A properly trained soldier knows how to hold back until the last second. These officers didn't hold back. They panicked." When he finished, the room was silent, and even the judge nodded slightly, jotting something in his notebook. Outside the courtroom, the block surrounding the courthouse was sealed off by iron barricades and a heavy security presence. Protesters filled both sidewalks, holding signs high with their hands and their eyes. From the speakers of civil rights groups came a woman's firm voice. "Justice doesn't come from swift charges, but from exposing how a system gets to pull the trigger and then turn away." Meanwhile, a group of veterans in faded uniforms stood quietly in the distance, each wearing a small black band on their arm, saying nothing, but their presence alone seemed to make the pavement beneath them feel heavier with gravity. Inside the courtroom, Camille was absent. Her attorney had informed her in advance of the session's content, but she declined to attend. Her reason was brief. "I won't step into a room where people are still asking whether my son held a weapon." Still, Camille's name hovered over every statement in the eyes of every witness, every prosecutor, like a silent weight that pulled the entire hearing into a deeper layer of truth. No one present denied that the light from Malik's phone reflecting off the screen had been misread as the glint of a barrel, and that mistake, whether born of instinct or bias, led to a bullet through the chest of a 16-year-old boy. At the end of the closed session, the judge made no declarations aside from confirming that a public hearing would take place within 2 weeks with full records and third-party oversight. But as those inside exited the room, they all carried the same heavy gaze. They had faced the fire, not the kind that burns in anger, but a cold fire, the kind that strips away every layer of judicial insulation in silence until only the core remains a boy with a phone, a bullet, and a society forced to look into that moment to see what it had long lost. A military attorney brought in as an expert on Camille's file shifted the atmosphere of the room entirely. Dressed in a gray suit, his hair cropped high, his demeanor calm like a man used to internal interrogations. He didn't bring emotion, only the weight of a file, hundreds of pages thick, neatly placed before him. He didn't speculate, didn't conclude, he simply read in a steady, low voice, item by item, like a battlefield time card. Camille L. Hayes, rank Commander, Delta Urban Force. Served in the Middle East, South America, and East Africa. Participated in 17 special operations missions over 12 years, 6 of those within elite action units, and 4 spent training rapid response forces on domestic bases. Area of training, urban environments. Surprise conditions, civilian settings, high pressure, confined space response. Specialty rapid target identification, decision-making in under 1 second, core principle, no mistakes. He paused, turned another page, eyes scanning italicized print, then read slower, as if letting each syllable drop onto the cold tile floor. Special Ops Module 4, Trigger Squeeze, Target Confirmation. No mistakes. No one said a word. No chair creaked. No one shifted. The entire room froze. Because those three final words landed like a verdict, one that needed no summation. In the training courses Camille had designed and taught, those life or death lessons had been etched into the bones of hundreds of soldiers. And now, the cruel paradox stood clear. The son of the woman who wrote the rule of no mistakes had been killed by a fundamental one. The attorney didn't underline that fact. He didn't need to. What he brought wasn't an accusation, but a brutal contrast between two worlds, one demanding absolute precision with every trigger pull, and one allowing rash decisions to be wrapped in the phrase instinctual response. The officials in the room, prosecutors and defense alike, avoided each other's eyes. Even the judge, composed through many previous sessions, paused for several seconds before turning to the next part of the transcript, because they all understood that from this point the case was no longer merely a dispute over justified police action. It had become a challenge to the quality of training, the ethics of the profession, and the system's own belief that it could get things wrong without paying full price. Outside the courtroom, journalists began to access portions of Camille's military record, now made public. Major outlets flooded with profiles. CNN ran the headline, "The mother who taught trigger discipline, her son killed by someone who violated it." The Guardian called it a tragedy of precision humiliated by panic. On military forums, veterans shared handwritten training notes authored by Camille, scanned from original documents with one line underlined in red. 1 second wrong, 1 life gone, and the whole system cracks. The silence in that room wasn't an end. It was the beginning of a chain reaction. Because when faced with undeniable evidence, with a nationally recognized military career, with the very lessons that had saved dozens of lives in combat, no one could credibly say this death came from bad lighting, unclear object, or situational reflex. When a mother has taught others how to see through smoke and fire, they can't accept her child being shot in broad daylight. And that's why in that room, during those 3 words, no mistakes, it became quieter than any graveyard. A graveyard of excuses, of rationalizations, of worn-out faith in self-correction. Because this time, Camille didn't need to speak. She had written it as doctrine, and the system had broken it with its own hand. In front of the police headquarters, once a quiet government building, in the heart of the administrative district, it had now become the focal point of anger and outrage. Protesters arrived in waves, holding signs high and chanting slogans. From civil rights organizations to students, veterans, single mothers, and even those who had never marched before, all were present. No official call for action was needed because Malik Jefferson's death had transcended being just an accident. It had become a symbol of raw injustice, and this time that symbol had a face, a name, and a story that weighed heavily on the hearts of those who heard it. Banners appeared like a forest, each carrying a message, but the most striking was a phrase written in thick black ink placed next to a portrait of Malik: "Don't shoot, I'm Elijah," a reference to another incident from the previous year where a young black man was shot for holding a violin. But this time the phrase stood beside the face of a 16-year-old boy, blood-stained white shirt, eyes dimming on the very sidewalk of his home. The online community simultaneously created a wave never seen before. Twitter accounts across the platform changed their profile pictures to images of Malik framed with a red border, "Justice for Jefferson." On TikTok, a clip from the live stream where Camille kneeled in her son's blood screaming the question, "Are you proud of yourselves?" was replayed endlessly as an unending indictment. Within 24 hours, nearly 50 million shares were recorded across American platforms alone. A journalist described it: "This is no longer a wave, but a flood, where silence is no longer an option." The online community didn't stop at sharing images. They began tracing the records of similar violent incidents, piecing together the systematic errors law enforcement had once covered up with legal jargon. A list of nearly 40 cases was compiled, juxtaposed with images of Camille and Malik, emphasizing history doesn't just repeat itself, it escalates. On the streets, every window began to display a picture of the boy. Black and white photos printed simply on regular paper, but when hung beside windows or next to American flags, they forced passers-by to stop. Some taped pictures of Camille's son alongside their own. Others placed the photo in the center of their living room mirrors, not to reflect, but to never forget. During an outdoor prayer vigil in a nearby city, a pastor spoke to the crowd. Today we mourn not just a life lost, but we are witnessing a society waking up in pain. And sometimes that awakening is the beginning of true justice. A video clip captured hundreds sitting in the middle of the street, each person placing a phone in front of them, screens displaying Malik's final image. No sound, only the light from the screens merging with the street lights, creating a chilling, haunting scene. Even the authorities could no longer sit idly by in the face of public pressure. Some federal lawmakers began calling for emergency hearings on police accountability in shootings of unarmed civilians. A petition gathered over 300,000 signatures within 2 days, demanding changes in risk assessment protocols and the use of force. And amid all the noise, Camille still didn't appear. She didn't respond to the press, didn't show up at any gatherings. But her image, even just a few seconds of her scream, was enough to keep the flame of justice smoldering in everyone. No one claimed this was just a matter for one neighborhood, one state, or one family. This was a question posed to the entire system. How many more boys will fall before a police officer learns to tell the difference between a phone and a gun? And this time, the public wasn't asking for an apology, but for change. As public outcry swelled like an unstoppable tide, another wave, silent but heavier, began to seep through mailrooms, press offices, and internal military emails, handwritten letters from reservists one by one, written in real ink on real paper with real signatures. She is our commander. The first line of most of these letters was the same as if they had discussed it beforehand, but in reality no one had. They all simply reacted instinctively, the instinct of those who had lived under Camille Hayes' command and understood the value of precision, discipline, and survival on the urban battlefield. The letters, some just a few lines, others 2 pages long, recounted the brutal training sessions, the simulated combat missions led by Camille, the time she stopped a whole exercise just to correct a rookie's grip on their rifle, simply because his sight was slightly off. One person wrote, "She looked me in the eye when I trembled during a drill and said, 1 second late, your teammate dies. Rewind. Do it again. Practice until your hands forget what shaking feels like." Another wrote, "She taught me that pulling the trigger is power, and power that is mistaken is not strength but disaster. Yet today they pulled the trigger on her son like he was trash." These letters were sent to the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the President's office, and especially to newsroom. Many editors had to allocate entire sections to publish excerpts from these letters because they were no longer personal opinions, but testimonies of a portrait distorted by societal bias. Meanwhile, in the city center, the mayor, who had previously stated, "We need to wait for the investigation before making judgments," suddenly appeared at a press conference, his face uneasy, eyes red-rimmed. He stepped up to the podium, not looking at the camera, simply placing both hands on the microphone and speaking in a choked voice, "I apologize. On behalf of the city, I bow my head before Camille Hayes, before her son, before the community that has been hurt." The words seemed enough to calm the situation, but the crowd outside would not accept it. Shouts began rising from the courtyard. "Resign, resign." No one threw anything. No one breached the barricades, but the intensity of each shout reverberated through the room as if someone was pounding against the walls. On social media, the hashtag #StepDownMrMayor trended nationwide within an hour. Several articles revisited the mayor's past, showing that every time he defended the police's use of violence, the online community began compiling old excerpts, reconstructing the entire picture of a system that covered for each other, and pointed out that today's apology came only after the public pressure exceeded safe limits. Outside City Hall, thousands stood motionless. No one breached the barricades, but each person carried an image of Camille, Malik, or both, with a simple, clear caption: "This is who you failed." The caption carried no specific accusation, but was enough to crush any defense. In a nearby park, a group of veterans held a silent prayer. They weren't carrying guns, they weren't in uniform, but each wore a dark blue cloth Delta Force's color tied around their left arm. One stepped forward, speaking briefly. "We stand here not out of hatred, but out of honor. Honor that has been violated." And as he turned away, the others bowed their heads, saying nothing, but no one left the line. They stood as a protective ring around a symbol in formation, a symbol of a mother who had taught soldiers to survive, but couldn't save her own son from death on a quiet street. By the end of the day, as the sun set and all news outlets replayed the scene of the mayor bowing his head, newsrooms began receiving hundreds of reader letters demanding the city hold a vote of no confidence. And from afar, from other states, groups began to prepare to travel with hand-painted banners, T-shirts with Camille's face, and unwavering stares. They weren't marching for an incident. They were marching for a question that had never been answered. When will silence no longer have the right to apologize? The late-night national news broadcast interrupted its regular programming to deliver an urgent announcement. The words scrolling across the screen held millions in suspense. The federal prosecutor charges 2 police officers with second-degree manslaughter in the case of Malik Jefferson. No beating around the bush, no avoiding the issue. The decision was delivered like a direct blow to a system used to evading responsibility. The special prosecutor appointed from Washington, a white man gray in hair with a history of handling military cases, stepped up to the podium, no introduction necessary. He placed his hands on the podium, staring directly into the camera as if delivering a message to every household. After reviewing all the evidence, the footage, the testimony, and the training documents, we have concluded that the act of firing that day did not meet any legal standards of imminent danger or reasonable self-defense. This is second-degree manslaughter, and it will be prosecuted under federal law. His final words landed like a heavy stone on the tiled floors of the halls that had long denied responsibility. At the police station, the reaction was one of chaos. Many officers, particularly from the unit directly involved, voiced their opposition. One said in a leaked internal meeting, "We're being used as scapegoats. They don't understand the pressure out there." Another spoke more harshly. "This is a witch hunt. One day we'll have to stop apologizing for doing our job." But the resistance was short-lived. Just a few hours after the announcement of the charges, another memo from the Department of Defense was sent to the police station instructing immediate cooperation and halting any interference with the investigation. This was not a recommendation, it was an administrative order signed digitally by the Chief of Staff. The message was clear. This case involves a senior officer from the Urban Warfare Unit. Therefore, the military will oversee the legal proceedings independently and prevent any pressure from local civilian forces. The front gate of the police station was reinforced with 2 unarmed military armored vehicles merely present as a reminder. A group of 3 senior officers from the Pentagon was sent to oversee the situation, reporting directly to the command. Inside the police force, the atmosphere became suffocating. Whispers grew quieter, and exchanges were now limited to official emails. The police chief, who had once stood at the center of the press conference storm, now appeared only behind frosted glass, no longer speaking. On social media, some close to the 2 indicted officers posted defense articles, but they faced a fierce backlash. This time, the public had more than just images of bloodshed and screams. They had complete military training records, wide-angle video from the balcony letters from veterans, and the identity of the mother. There were no longer any gaps for justification. The next morning, when the transport vehicles came to take the 2 officers from their homes, a small group of citizens stood silently on the sidewalk. No one raised banners. No one shouted insults. They simply stood there wearing T-shirts with the faces of Camille and Malik staring at those who once held the power of life and death. A young woman in the crowd exclaimed as the vehicle rolled away, "We once prayed for the law to see us. Now we want the law to look at itself." And that statement was recorded, broadcast repeatedly across television networks. It wasn't just one person's wish, but a collective warning: if the system doesn't examine itself, society's gaze will do it for them. The first hearing was scheduled to take place under the protection of both the judicial and military forces, a rare precedent in modern history and a signal that this time no one would be allowed to avoid the shadow of the truth. The death of an unarmed boy on his own doorstep was no longer the tragedy of a black family. It had become a public test for the entire nation. When justice stands before the barrel of a gun, who will defend what's right and who will only bow their head in silence? Camille remained absent from every newspaper, every news broadcast, every hearing and press conference, despite her name appearing more frequently than anyone else's for 10 straight days. The media dubbed it the silence of steel, not because she was avoiding the issue, but because it carried a weight that demanded respect. Many expected a speech, an appearance, a condemnation, or even a public tear to cover up the loss. But Camille wouldn't let anyone touch her pain. Each day, news outlets still built their evening reports around the question, "Where is Camille Hayes?" Reporters camped outside the old house she once shared with her son, but the iron gate remained firmly closed. At the Pentagon, the military spokesperson was asked the same question during the Friday morning press briefing. He didn't deflect, nor did he provide any unnecessary details. He simply said, "She has the right to remain silent. The mission is still ongoing." That brief answer left the entire press room silent. No follow-up questions came immediately. "The mission is still ongoing." Those 4 simple words opened up a world of speculation. What was Camille being sent to do? Was she still a part of the system she once trained, or was the military trying to protect someone too important to be dragged into a public debate? Those speculations, of course, ignited a new frenzy online, but within the flow of information, no one truly denied the legitimacy of her silence. A mother who had just lost her son screaming so loudly that it stilled. The nation now chose to keep her voice quiet, as though the silence itself was the last weapon she wanted to wield. A former Special Forces member trained by Camille wrote on his personal page, "When someone like her doesn't speak, it means she's waiting for the moment her voice will explode. And believe me, when it explodes, it won't be a sound. It will be the consequence." In military forums, veterans shared old photos taken with Camille during training sessions she led. Some pictures showed her standing next to a small recruit, her hand on his shoulder in the shooting range. Others showed her adjusting a soldier's finger on the rifle's trigger just because it was slightly off. Under each photo, the only comment posted was, "She knew timing. She knew timing." And this time, the entire country seemed to understand in its own way that her silence was not a gap in the story, but the breath of the next chapter about to unfold. A veteran journalist wrote in an analysis, "People often think that loss makes one weaker, but Camille Hayes shows the opposite. Loss has made her unpredictable and dangerous in a way the whole system must fear." Meanwhile, the Pentagon began implementing measures to control internal information, restricting any leaks related to Camille's mission files. Some international newspapers started reporting that, according to confidential sources, Camille had trained rapid response teams in Eastern Europe and the Middle East in campaigns that had never been publicly disclosed. If true, her presence in the public eye was not just the story of a mother who lost her child, but also a reminder of a silent force shaped by discipline scars and absolute precision. A military analyst commented, "When she's silent, the military isn't worried. When the whole country asks where she is and the military responds with, 'The mission is still ongoing,' then you should understand they're not hiding anything. They're giving her the time she needs." And so Camille Hayes became the central figure in a story from which she chose to withdraw from the spotlight. But her absence did not make the story fade. On the contrary, way. It made every old clip, every frame, every word she had written in her report become a valuable resource to be excavated, analyzed, and remembered. In a society overwhelmed by information, Camille chose silence to force the entire system to speak the truth. And in that world, people began to relearn an old concept: silence is also an act. There was no press release, no camera lights, and no reporters allowed access. The meeting took place behind thick steel doors at a federal security facility where every phone was confiscated from the lobby and all documents were stamped classified to the highest standard. Attendees included representatives from the Department of Justice, the Pentagon, the National Security Agency, and 2 special advisors from the White House. They didn't sit around a long table like in movies, but were dispersed in small groups, each holding a stack of files, speaking in low voices with tense eyes. At the center of the room, an electronic board displayed the large headline, "Internal Assessment of Systemic Impact in the Malik Jefferson Case." Here, the issue was no longer the tragedy of a family or the mistake of 2 officers. It had become a puzzle about structural flaws, about how a law enforcement system could create death and then bow its head as though it were just an unfortunate variable. The first file opened was the service records of the 2 officers involved. The first few lines contained nothing unusual: their years in service training sessions and a few commendations for completed tasks. But as the pages turned, more troubling details emerged. Both had been named in internal complaints regarding racial discrimination. One case was from last year at a supermarket parking lot where a black boy was stopped and searched for having a suspicious backpack. The incident was dismissed due to lack of evidence, but the officer who wrote the report, a lower-ranking officer, was later reassigned to a desk job and never returned to the front lines. Another case involved a night arrest where a black man was forced to kneel for 3 minutes while handcuffed. The internal investigation concluded that the prolonged restraint was necessary to ensure team safety, but another report from a Latina officer stated I suggested loosening the restraint, but they dismissed me. Both had extreme attitudes towards the black suspect. The atmosphere in the meeting room grew thick. The people who once represented major institutions now sat in silence, their hands clenched, brows furrowed. A representative from the Department of Defense lowered his voice. "If these details leak, we're not just dealing with a case, we're facing a federal trust crisis." A member of Justice responded coldly. "It's already leaked, and the public is analyzing every line. We're no longer ahead of the public, we're catching up." That remark seemed to mark the end of all denials. The entire room seemed to simultaneously realize Malik's death was no longer Camille Hayes' issue alone. It had become a mirror reflecting the entire law enforcement structure, and the fact that the 2 officers had kept their guns drawn the entire time despite clear warning signs was a blow to the trust of an entire generation. A proposal came from the military legal team to expand the investigation not only into Malik's case, but into the entire history of the police unit involved, including a review of training policies and behavior oversight. Another representative added, "If Camille Hayes was the one who trained special forces to never miss a shot, then this government must also learn how to wield power without error." The room fell silent, and then a slow nod of agreement was formed without the need for a vote. At the end of the meeting, an internal memo was circulated: all acts of racial discrimination in the armed forces and law enforcement would be thoroughly reviewed. This order wasn't for public relations, it was a directive for action. Meanwhile, outside, Camille still hadn't appeared, but her absence seemed like a long shadow cast over every door of power, forcing each person to look at themselves, their responsibilities, and the gap society had long considered just a part of everyday life. A gap that today, in the darkness of a closed-door meeting, was finally called by its rightful name. A chilling silence filled the meeting room as the final file was projected onto the screen, detailing Camille Hayes, Senior Commander, Delta Urban Force, survived 8 Red Zone campaigns, urban response training, strict discipline, capable of handling extreme risks in chaotic environments. Beneath it was a new note added by the National Security Agency, survived battle, and injustice. This wasn't a tribute. It was a silent indictment of the system that should have protected someone like her. At that moment, a female lawyer present in the room and having pursued dozens of civil cases involving police violence stood up suddenly. She gripped her file tightly, her eyes fixed on the screen, her voice hoarse with anger. This isn't an accident. This is a system rotten from within. It consumes those who should be the last line of defense for justice. Her words cut through the air like a blade. Those still trying to deny that Malik's death was an unforeseen incident no longer had a leg to stand on. All the signs had been clear from the start. Internal complaints ignored extremist behavior, unchecked training standards loosened, and ultimately, a bullet in the chest of a black teenager holding a phone. Everyone in the room understood that the most terrifying part wasn't the 2 officers firing the shot, but the dozens of silent nods behind them. Documents marked insufficient evidence. Light warnings, eyes turned away. The lawyer wasn't a public figure, but her words that day were later quoted in an editorial. When a system rewards fear and punishes trust, it has already chosen its next victim. Outside, the public continued to gather, unaware that inside the silent building, Camille's name had ceased to be a personal title and had been elevated to a strategic symbol. Social response tier maps were being drawn based on her level of influence. A media analyst predicted if Camille were to make a single statement, the national security forces would have to prepare for an uncontrollable chain reaction. But Camille remained silent, and that silence made the entire system more anxious. They couldn't guess what she would do, but they began to realize that her silence wasn't just grief. It was a purposeful waiting for the final link to break, waiting for someone within the system to have the courage to speak the truth before she was forced to. Even those who had criticized her began to retreat from their old arguments. On a news channel, typically supportive of law enforcement, an editor admitted, "I used to think Camille Hayes should step forward and tell this nation that she forgives. But now I understand some things don't require forgiveness. They require facing the truth." The military, though quiet, also showed signs of shifting. Some senior generals silently sent their condolences to Camille's family through internal channels accompanied by brief notes. "We know she hasn't given up." And so, amid a raging storm, pulling the entire nation into a whirlwind of questions, Camille, the mother, the commander, the survivor, became the line between silence and justice. The system that had allowed bullets to be fired by prejudice now had to confront the very invisible weapon, the uncompromising existence of a woman who had walked through war zones, yet was pushed into a battle where blood was spilled right on her doorstep. And this time, no one would be allowed to call it an accident. In the small town square, once a peaceful gathering spot, every weekend a new memorial has been erected. It is not large nor elaborate, just a block of black stone set on a cold concrete base, surrounded by a low iron fence and bundles of dry flowers wrapped in newspaper. In the center of the stone, behind a bulletproof glass case, lies the only object, a bloodstained military badge, its corners worn and the plating chipped from impact, but the central engraving still visible: Delta Urban Force, Commander Hayes. People who approach stand in silence, no one daring to speak, simply standing there, hands gently placed on their hearts. Beneath the badge is a small inscription carefully engraved: "This belonged to Commander Hayes and her son," a statement that affirms service and acknowledges loss. No extra words, no political symbols, but anyone who passes by understands that it is the culmination of 2 worlds crushed together in one moment. Some have asked why the word belonged is used in past tense, but they soon realize it's not because Camille is gone, but because the mother has become something else no longer belonging solely to the military or her family. She has been pulled from her personal role to become the unwanted symbol of an America desperate for the truth it has long tried to avoid. That badge, which was merely a unit insignia, has now become the mark of an inescapable tragedy. The blood on it will not be wiped off, not out of carelessness, but because those who placed it behind the glass decided no one should forget that the highest honor can still lie under the boots of a blind system. High school students began writing essays about Camille Hayes. Military professors mentioned her in urban psychological strategy classes as an example of the moral limits at the intersection of law and violence. Some proposed naming a new training facility after her, but the suggestion was rejected for creating division. Eventually, a quieter choice was made. Her name was included in a special training program for civil operational control, not to honor her, but to remind. She was placed in the curriculum not as a hero, but as a witness to collective failure. At the memorial, people continue to visit every day. Some are reservists in civilian clothes, some mothers with young children, some who once opposed her but now silently bow their heads. A young black boy around 10 years old wearing a white shirt stood before the glass for a long time and then asked his mother, "Why is there blood on the badge?" The mother bent down and whispered, "Because someone wore it even in their greatest pain." The child didn't ask any further, just nodded and stood still. This wasn't a lesson taught from books, but something learned from silence, where the truth needs no explanation. And so the final trace left after a chain of actions, reactions, anger, and tears was not the gun, the verdict, or the protests. It was a blood-stained badge behind glass, a silent reminder when something is lost. Acknowledgement, apology, or judgment comes too late, and each person who passes by carries within them a question never dared to ask aloud: if that day those two officers had seen that badge before. Pulling the trigger, would things have been different? But the truth lies still in the dry blood, and Camille Hayes, though still alive, has forever become a name that remains in history. At the gray-black stone monument in the middle of the small square, handwritten letters began to appear more and more. At first, there were just a few folded pieces of paper tucked under the stone to keep them from the wind, with hurriedly scrawled words as if written by a stranger's desperate apology. "I didn't know, truly didn't know. I'm sorry for my silence." Then, each day, the number of letters grew folded neatly into white envelopes sealed in waterproof plastic bags or tucked inside tattered notebooks. Some taped them directly to the fence, others carefully tied ribbons around them, and many folded the papers into triangles like the way the military folds the flag for a family. Each letter carried its own sorrow, but they all pointed to one name: Camille Hayes. "Please forgive me for doubting you. I stayed silent when I saw similar things happen. If my child were the one lying there, I'm not sure I'd be able to keep my sanity. You don't need to forgive me, but I need to confess." These were the words left by people unsigned, with no need for a reply, merely a late attempt to mend what had been broken. There were even letters from retired police officers, those who once wore the uniform but never dared to speak up. I saw my subordinates acting out of control. I chose to turn a blind eye. "Camille, I owe you the truth." Each morning, city workers would clean the dust-covered glass on the monument, neatly arrange the letters into piles, and place the wet ones into storage bins. The media began referring to the area as the corner of public apology. Some mocked it, calling it a modern-day confession ritual, but it only caused thousands to stop and reflect. No one came to take selfies. They came to lower their voices, to finally admit that indifference is also a form of complicity. And among the hundreds of letters, no one found any response from Camille. She remained somewhere unseen, unheard. No press conferences, no inspiring speeches, no raised fists filled with symbols, only an absence that stretched on like an unstitched wound. Many speculated that Camille was being protected at a military base place, or perhaps living in a distant suburb under a new identity. But wherever she was, everyone felt her silent presence, like an irreplaceable void. The media began calling Camille the mother who doesn't forgive, but this wasn't criticism. It was the recognition that some wounds need no explanation, and that silence is also a final answer. Some wondered why Camille didn't say anything, not even a word. But it was precisely that silence that made her more memorable. In a world of noise, where every injustice is screamed into the cameras, utter silence became the heaviest burden, forced people to look inward instead of waiting for someone else to speak. It made everyone ask themselves, what am I doing when others lose so much? And perhaps that was the only thing Camille wanted to preserve. A story that doesn't end with tears, anger, or even forgiveness, but with confrontation. Not between people, but between a society and its own conscience. When the city had seemingly become accustomed to the silence of Camille Hayes as an unchangeable part of life, a quiet media shock occurred from the inbox of a freelance journalist named Riley Monroe. He wasn't famous, nor did he work for a major news outlet, just a young reporter who had sent over 40 emails hoping for a faint chance of a response from Camille. And one morning in the middle of the month, when he opened his email as a habit, he froze as he saw the subject line from C. Hayes. You asked what I would say. His heart tightened as he stood on the edge of a historical crack now revealed. The letter was exactly 1 page long, no attachments, no formal greetings, and no titles. But every sentence cut deep into every prejudice society had tried to cover up. I don't want revenge, Camille wrote. Revenge is the easiest thing a soldier can do. I was trained to handle targets, to assess threats in an instant. But after everything, I realized that the hardest thing isn't pulling the trigger on time, it's learning not to pull the trigger. She didn't mention any titles, didn't refer to her son by name, only calling him my boy. She didn't blame anyone, nor did she ask for forgiveness. Each line was a short conclusion, heavy as a boulder, making Riley read it 5 times before he dared post it publicly. I don't want anyone to kneel by the blood of their loved one like I did, Camille continued. Not because they are soldiers or because they wear badges, but because they are human. It's time we stop demanding that mothers have to scream before their pain is recognized. These words spread quickly like wildfire across forums, newspapers, and social media. There were no accompanying images, no exclusive video recording, but everyone knew only Camille could have written those words. The cold, composed tone in each letter made even those who had once doubted her sit up straight and read it fully. No one knew where Camille was, nor did she respond again after that. But that response felt like the final shard of the mirror that the public had been shaping over the past few weeks. Not the shouting mother, not the legendary gun wielder, but a warrior who chose to step back so others could step up. In one brief closing line, she wrote, I used to teach soldiers how to seize the initiative, but that day I just wished someone knew how to stop. That was the first and perhaps the last time Camille Hayes spoke out after everything. No anger, no tears, just someone who had seen enough death to understand that life isn't found in orders, but in the choice to hold on to humanity at the right moment. With that letter, Camille didn't step onto a stage, didn't receive a Medal of Honor, and didn't join any panel discussions. But in police academies and military centers across the country, excerpts from her letter were included as part of the official training materials for conflict psychology courses. New officers, reading the line, I don't want revenge. I want others not to have to kneel like I did, were left silent not by orders but by the direct blow to the very core of the profession they were entering. And, just like that, without needing to say another word, Camille Hayes did what the shouting on the streets, the fierce protests, and even the passionate speeches couldn't do. She made people stop and think deeply. Camille's response quickly transcended the limits of a personal letter. In just 36 hours, the phrase, "I don't want revenge. I want others not to have to kneel like I did," appeared on thousands of posters, stickers, t-shirts, and handheld signs. It was printed in white, on black, black on red, scrawled with paint on the gray brick walls of impoverished neighborhoods, and in large digital prints in busy city squares. No one needed to know where it came from because the entire country already knew. University students painted it as graffiti on hallways, and high school students wrote it in their notebooks as a silent reminder. Elderly people carefully printed it out, sticking it on their car windows next to crucifix pictures as a new form of prayer for a chaotic era. This short phrase went straight into the hearts of everyone, bypassing reason and needing no shouting. It was the pain distilled into words demanding neither agreement nor rebuttal, but forcing others to face it. "I want others not to have to kneel like I did" became a gentle curse, sharp enough to make everyone remember, merciful enough to make everyone realize they had to act. The press called it the quote of the decade. Law schools, journalism schools, and even police academies included it in their curricula as an example of the power of unadorned truth. Even those who had stayed silent in the face of similar incidents began to ask, if this is a mistake, why does it keep repeating? Meanwhile, a photo capturing the moment. Camille knelt beside her son, her face bloodied and pained, her gaze lost in the sunset, her hands trembling as she lifted his head one last time. This photo, initially shared with the brief caption, "Justice," her way, became an emblem. Soon, illustrators recreated it in hundreds of versions, from black and white pencil drawings to large oil paintings, from bold classic prints to street graffiti pieces. In each version, the common thread was Camille's gaze, without anger, without bitterness, just a quiet layer of pain that reached deep into the most primal instincts of motherhood. A week later, at memorial services held in various cities, people raised this photo in place of slogans. They no longer needed to shout. They held the photo high, stood silent for a minute, and then quietly walked away as Camille had chosen silence to force society to speak. Major newspapers ran this photo on their front pages with captions like "The Cost of Silence" or "When Mothers Break." But no one used it as a commercial symbol or media tool. Civil rights organizations unanimously agreed that this photo should only be used as a reminder, not for raising funds or campaigning. And this only made it more sacred. An anonymous group of artists recreated this photo with bent metal rods in the center of the city park. No lights, no nameplates, just the outline, mimicking the hands of a mother cradling her child on a cold stone base. Passers-by immediately recognized it, no explanation needed. Children stopped and asked their parents who the person in the photo was, and the parents would have to find the words to explain not only about a woman named Camille Hayes, but about a society that once thought silence was harmless, about a blood-soaked red day in the sun, and about a phrase that didn't need to be repeated but still echoed in the hearts of an entire generation. 4 weeks after Malik Jefferson was shot dead on the sidewalk, a draft bill labeled 312H42 was presented to the state legislature with the simple title, the Malik Act. No fiery slogans, no anguished speeches. The draft began with a quote, "Because unclear moments have killed the future of a child." The proposal came from Loretta Raines, the first African-American congresswoman from the district who had remained silent during the investigation, avoiding media debates. But this time she stood up in the middle of the session holding only one photo. Malik's face looking directly into the lens with a half smile, tousled hair, and eyes full of hope. No one in the room stood to oppose her when she said, "This is why we cannot forget." The contents of the Malik Act were not long, but they cut through every gap in the law enforcement system like a knife. The first provision required all police officers' body cameras to automatically store and encrypt data on site without manual intervention. The second provision stated that any signal disruption during duty must be reported to an independent oversight agency within 6 hours. The third provision demanded that third-party investigators, including civil representatives, be given access to data to ensure transparency and impartiality. Most importantly, the final provision established a legal precedent. If body camera data went missing or was tampered with during incidents involving gunfire, resulting in civilian casualties, the involved officer would be automatically suspended for an initial investigation. The bill was presented clearly without sensationalism, but as soon as Malik appeared on the screen during the session, every camera turned toward it. News outlets nationwide picked it up. Major media shared links to the original documents, and those who had wept for Camille now began to act for Malik. Educational organizations held extracurricular classes on civil rights for high school students. Policy advocacy groups called for citizens to sign in support at local polling places. On social media, the hashtag #MalikAct quickly shot to the top of the trending list within 18 hours. The current police chief was forced to speak up for the first time since the initial hesitant press conference. "We will comply with the provisions of the bill if it is passed," he said cautiously. Some police unions protested, claiming the bill would make officers work in fear of making mistakes, but others countered better to fear making a mistake than for someone to take a bullet in broad daylight. The debate soon moved beyond legal boundaries and became a social dialogue about the limits of power and the presence of justice. Although the bill was still in draft form, many localities had already begun implementing similar principles. One district hung a photo of Malik in front of the police station as a reminder. Some places printed the words "Record to Protect" on police uniforms. Documentaries began collecting interviews recording each step of the journey from bloodstains on a white shirt to the bill on a desk. And far away, Camille Hayes still remained silent, but a defense advisor confirmed that she was the first person to receive the draft bill for review and comments. She didn't respond, but she wrote one line on the edge of the document: "If you really want to protect the people, start by stopping the protection of what harms them." The Malik Act has not yet been passed, but it has lived on like an arrow deeply embedded in the spine of a system that once seemed unshakable. And it seems that even though the child's body now lies on the cracked pavement, he is quietly leading a new march, moving straight into the heart of justice. The governor signed the Malik Act draft on an unannounced morning. No press conference, no reporters, no speeches, no handshake with the victim's family representatives, as with other laws passed before. He entered his office, instructed his staff to leave, and silently signed under a simple phrase, "Approve." An administrative staffer confirmed the document was immediately sent to the archives, bypassing ceremonial procedures. No one saw him speak a word that day, and the scheduled press conference afterward was canceled for personal reasons. But the people didn't need him to speak. They understood this was an acknowledgement not of fault but of limits. The limits of power of denial and of the ability to escape responsibility when blood is spilled on the streets. Immediately after the news was released on the state government website, supporters of the bill flooded the streets. They did not cheer. They did not honk horns or sing. They simply walked in small groups holding up pictures of Malik and Camille's words printed boldly on red backgrounds: "I want others not to kneel as I did." A white mother walked with her son holding a sign, "My child is protected. What about hers?" A veteran stood beside City Hall, eyes fixed on the flag hanging in the square, whispering, "This law should have been here 10 years ago." National broadcasters reported the news in a tone more solemn than usual. A news anchor read the statement without concealing their emotion. The Malik Act has been signed into law. No parade, just someone surviving long enough to make it a reality. Schools began incorporating the law into civics education. Workshops on professional responsibility and law enforcement saw a record number of sign-ups. In classrooms, teachers told the story of Malik as part of a lesson on trust and consequences. Some don't live long enough to see the law law change because of them. Malik was one of those. However, during those days, Camille Hayes still did not appear. No speeches, no messages, no photos. Close sources indicated she had left her residence possibly under the invitation of a military base in the northern region. An internal source confirmed she had declined all interview requests, as well as the honorary medal the Department of Defense wanted to present her. On the desk of a commanding officer, the military badge engraved with Commander Hayes still lay in its envelope, accompanied by a handwritten note: "If you need me, do what's right. If you're not ready, don't do anything at all." Camille did not need to speak. Society knew what it had to say. When her name was mentioned in Congress, no one dared to call her the victim. People referred to her as a symbol, as a living testament to the limits of endurance, as the woman who vanished just as justice stepped into the light, holding on to the purity that justice requires. And in the photo that had circulated across the internet, the image of her kneeling beside her son with dried blood on her hands, eyes not lifted, people no longer saw it as an image of sorrow, but as a warning that everyone has their limits. And when a mother, a warrior, a citizen no longer speaks, this country is forced to answer for her, not with apologies, but with law. And this time, the law bore her son's name. At a base surrounded by Rocky Mountains and arid land in the North Delta, base's new training season officially began in silence. No opening ceremonies, no long speeches. A group of recruits in worn-out uniforms stood tall in the training yard when the steel doors swung open, the sound of footsteps, sharp and metallic, echoing against the concrete. Camille Hayes emerged from the shadows, her cap low, her face expressionless. Those who knew her from before said she had changed not in her words, but in her gaze. That gaze was now sharp as a bayonet, cold as the desert wind at night. "We used to train to survive," one trainer told the recruits, "but from today, you will learn not to make mistakes." Camille did not introduce herself, did not mention the past, did not mention the death of her son, and did not mention the badge that had caused civil officials to bow their heads. She simply stepped into the center of the yard and signaled for a young soldier to step forward. The soldier hesitated, glanced at the commanding officer, then stepped up, his shoulders stiff. Camille looked straight into his eyes and asked, "If you saw a child holding a phone standing in front of his house, what would you do?" The soldier hesitated, his lips trembling. Camille did not wait for an answer. She turned to the whole team and coldly said, "If it takes you 5 seconds to distinguish between a human life and a presumption, turn around. This camp is not for slow minds." Since her return, Camille has not given interviews, not answered the media. Journalists who came to the camp's gates were turned away. A guard simply stated, "She has nothing to say to you. She left all her words at the place where her son lies." But what Camille did resonated louder than any speech. In just 3 weeks, the dropout rate for the recruits doubled compared to previous years. Psychological tests had to be adjusted because the intensity of the training had far exceeded standard. But, strangely, the pass rate for the first stage was higher. Those who stayed admitted Camille Hayes doesn't teach how to fight. She teaches how not to be wrong, not even once. In the simulation room, Camille recreated the scene of the shooting. She had the soldiers watch a video cut from the live stream that had gone viral, slowing it down frame by frame, analyzing each hand movement, every approach the police took. Then she presented 3 simulated scenarios, and each group had to handle them in real time. If anyone fired incorrectly, the training ended right there. No one has the right to be forgiven when others pay with their lives, Camille said, her eyes never leaving the screen. Because when the command to shoot comes from fear, it is no longer a military action, but a betrayal. Though no one dared ask, the entire base knew Camille had returned not to escape her pain, but to train others to avoid the blood she once carried. The trainees who thought they knew everything about about tactics, now sat motionless at her reminder. War is not as terrifying as the mistake of someone with a weapon, but no heart. On a special evening, Camille gathered the whole team at the flag yard, the wind blowing sand everywhere, but everyone was present. In her hand was a crumpled yellowed letter, Malik's final letter to her never delivered. She did not read it aloud. She simply held it up in front of her chest and said, "This is the only person I ever failed to protect, and I will not let anyone else receive a letter like this." After that day, Camille was often seen walking around the base at dawn, holding a cold cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the east where the sun slowly rose over the cold sand. She didn't talk much, but those who encountered her nodded in silent respect. Some started calling her by her old code name, Ghost Storm. The Silent Storm, the one who once led the fastest counterattacks in war zones, now instilling a new fear in each recruit. The fear of losing a life due to prejudice or misjudgment. That wind, which seemed to have died when Malik fell, now rose from where Camille stood. It wasn't loud nor furious. It crept through each drill, each warning, each stern glance from a mother who had lost her child yet still upheld discipline. And that wind from the dry earth of Delta Base was quietly preparing a generation that would never allow a name like Malik's to be spoken again in sorrow. No more kneeling, no more shouting, only action, precise and unyielding. Under the scorching midday sun, the concrete of the training yard reflected blinding light as the recruits stood in formation, sweat soaking them after a grueling training session. Camille walked past each of them, her gaze piercing every small movement under her scrutiny. No one dared speak, no one dared breathe too loudly. Only when Camille stopped in front of a young recruit, not yet 20, with eyes full of uncertainty after a life-or-death decision simulation, did he hesitate and ask, his voice shaken but clear, "Have you ever regretted teaching others to use a gun?" The question dropped like a gunshot in the silence. The whole team froze, no one daring to look up. Camille didn't respond immediately. She studied him for a long moment, considering whether to answer militarily or with her heart. Finally, she spoke slowly, each word cold and sharp, cutting through the air. No, I don't regret it, but I regret not teaching them how to identify a target before pulling the trigger. The whole line seemed to hold its breath. That statement wasn't philosophical, wasn't emotional, but simply a fact spoken by someone who had witnessed the worst consequence of teaching a skill without the morality behind it. Camille didn't avoid, didn't hide her losses with words. She just spoke the truth. From that answer, the atmosphere on the base shifted. The drills were no longer repetitions of orders, but silent commitments to themselves by each soldier. That they weren't just learning to fight, but learning to think. Camille's lessons never began with battle plans, but always with the question, what if the person facing you is someone's brother? The real-world scenarios were no longer just theoretical but carried moral weight. Camille didn't need to shout, didn't need to recount the past. She was present as a living testament, making every look, every fall, every second of hesitation a reminder. If you make a mistake, someone might die out there. After training the recruits who once thought themselves tough began to write in journals. Many admitted that the line, "I regret not teaching them to identify a target," had changed them more than a year of special training. It wasn't just about personal responsibility, it was a warning about the ripple effect of every smallest decision. A decision to shoot, irreversible. A mistake, leading to the destruction of an entire family. Camille never asked them to remember her son's name, never mentioned Malik in her lessons. But each time she held up the simulation picture of a child, every recruit saw the face of the boy. Black skin, white shirt phone in hand, blood soaking the concrete. The images once spread on social media now live again in each simulation as part of a collective memory for the new generation of soldiers. Camille knew her pain couldn't save her son, but it could save other mothers from having to kneel as she once did. She didn't need forgiveness, didn't need empathy. The only thing she needed was to ensure that no one would ever pull the trigger out of fear again, and no one would ever die because of their skin color or the light reflected from a phone screen. In the barren earth of the base, Camille planted a new seed, not strength but awareness, and each sprout that grows will carry a silent reminder. Distinguishing right from wrong is not a skill. It's a responsibility before you're ever allowed to carry a weapon. No alarms rang in the morning news, and there were no fiery headlines about Camille Hayes' case on the front pages. The once boiling comments gradually quieted, and the hashtags that had once dominated social media were swept away by the churn of new short-lived outrages. But for those who had witnessed, who had touched a part of that tragedy, the echo still lingered, unpretentious, unprompted. Camille didn't give interviews, didn't appear on television, and didn't attend any public hearings. She returned to her position in the military, continuing her training duties with a gaze that made anyone stand up straight. The media dubbed it Hayes' gaze, the gaze of a woman who lost her son to a gunshot of a warrior who had survived countless battles but was struck down by the actions of the very civil force she had once served. This phrase began to spread throughout the military into police forces, and even into speeches at law enforcement academies. Hayes' gaze became a symbol of silent judgment. When an officer ignored protocol to make a decision, that look of hers would appear. When a rookie hesitated in a simulation with a target of a young boy in a white shirt, Camille's shadow loomed. Identify the target before pulling the trigger. No one mentioned that Camille had once belonged to Delta Force. What people remembered was the moment she collapsed over her son's blood, the way her eyes blazed when the officer pulled the wrong wallet, the words in her written testimony. I don't believe a mother needs to explain her pain. That was a legacy no one could strip away. It was passed through her gaze, lived in the silence of society, making those who had once been indifferent look at themselves. In ethics classes and law enforcement, Camille's image holding Malik's body became a wordless lesson. At a small corner of a military memorial, the bloodstained badge still sat there beneath the words, "This belonged to Commander Hayes," and her son. Occasionally, passers-by would stop, a few would take photos, and most simply bowed their heads and silently moved on. The reverence in the quiet spread like a belief, a reminder never forget, even as the world moves on. Senior officers began proposing mandatory retraining on situation identification for the entire police force after the incident. No one dared publicly mention Camille in the files, but everyone knew who had started that reform. They simply whispered after the Hayes incident. In a closed-door meeting between the Pentagon and the Department of Justice, a young assistant wrote in the meeting notes the final line, "No more Maliks." That line was later crossed out in the official document, but the draft was still saved in the internal archive. Elsewhere, in an urban strategy class, an older instructor silently displayed Camille's image on the projector. No lecture, no introduction. He simply looked in the class and said, "You learn how to kill, so today you learn how to live." A student sitting at the back of the room, a new recruit transitioning from police to military, bent down when looking into Camille's eyes in the photo. No one criticized him because they all understood that what haunted people was not Camille shouting, but her looking through the layers of training rank and titles into the rotten core of a system. And no one dared to turn away. Hayes' gaze became a symbol without a declaration, a kind of unspoken language that anyone who had touched that tragedy understood. It entered the minds of those in uniform like a silent question. Next time, who will you look at through the barrel? There is no precedent, no law that records Camille's story. But the legacy she left runs deeper than any written document, because it forced people to take responsibility not by duty, but by humanity. And that is something that whistles badges and commands never created. In that silence, Camille still exists without saying a word, only with her gaze. And those eyes long ago no longer belong to her alone. At the foot of a white stone statue, where the image of a young boy holding a book with his head bowed is carved. Camille stood silently, holding a small bouquet of white lilies, each delicate petal trembling in the wind as if breathing. It was the first time she returned to the high school where Malik had once studied, where he would often come home with ink stains on his sleeve and eyes full of plans for the next day. Now only the quiet playground remained and aching stillness. On the cement under the statue, hundreds of other bouquets had been placed, some with tiny handwritten notes. "You were Malik. I wish I had learned from you. They shot him, but they can't erase the meaning he left behind." Camille bent down, placing her flowers at the statue's base, then raised her eyes to the carved face. Not an exact likeness of her son, but still evoking everything. It was a fleeting moment, almost unnoticed, but the gatekeeper in the distance saw clearly. Camille pressed her lips together, then smiled faintly, a small crack of sunlight in the storm. In the morning literary magazine a black poet wrote, "She fights with silence and wins with pain." The short poem, placed at the very end of the reader's opinion section without a headline or photo, made readers pause. The words captured what media reports, legal statements, or speeches had never reached. Camille Hayes didn't shout before cameras didn't rally the crowd. She moved forward as though carrying all the pain of others without revealing any cracks. She chose not to speak, not to question, but that silence made all other gaps resonate louder. A politician who had once opposed the Department of Defense remarked, "If she spoke, we could counter, but she doesn't, and because of that, we are exposed." The moment Camille placed the flowers wasn't covered by the media. A student walking through the school grounds happened to capture the moment with a phone, then posted it online with the caption, "Some victories need no guns, no power, just her looking and standing there." The clip didn't go viral, didn't make a storm, but quietly amassed hundreds of thousands of shares like a form of faith. People began to refer to Camille as an unofficial symbol of unyielding justice. She didn't need rhetoric. Her presence, filled with sorrow yet unwavering, was the statement. State police academies proposed adding a lesson called the Camille Case Study to their training curriculum. A lesson not about weapons or arrest procedures, but about target assessment and the psychological consequences of a mistaken shot. In the first class, the instructor only showed the image of Camille kneeling beside her son's blood, saying, "From this picture, recount the entire incident without blaming anyone. Everyone must learn this." Camille didn't attend any memorials, didn't give speeches, didn't send thank you notes. She continued to teach to train, and every evening in the corner of her office, she placed a small photo frame. Inside was Malik, smiling broadly, hugging her with dirt-stained hands. A photo taken when they practiced first aid in the backyard when he was 12. The young soldiers Camille trained now passed down an unwritten principle before pulling the trigger. Imagine the victim has a mother like Camille. That thought alone would pause their hands for just a second, and sometimes that second would save a life. Camille's silence made the public stop and gradually understand. The deepest form of resistance was not destruction, but refusing to disappear. Camille existed as a question that society had to answer, and the answer, as the poet wrote, was a victory that didn't require a legal win. She reclaimed her right to be a mother, to feel pain, to exist, right in the system that had tried to deny it, by bending down, placing the flowers, and smiling. At the eastern end of Delta Base, a simple black granite statue was erected unadorned and modest. 3 lines were carved into the stone, sharp and concise, like a knife cut Elijah Malik Jefferson, child of a warrior, taken by an unrestrained hand, remembered by a gaze that will never close. There was no birth date, no date of death, because the designer said, "We don't build to talk about death. We build to speak of what was taken and what will never be taken." Since the statue's unveiling, Delta Base has become a place where more strangers come than to official memorials. But they don't make noise, don't light candles, don't raise banners. They just stand there, One by one, they approach, laying their hands on the stone as if trying to pass something on, or take something away that can't yet be named. An elderly woman from Alabama drove 6 hours to get there. She carried an old photograph. Her son was killed during a police crackdown in 1992. She had no tears left. She whispered as she placed her hand on the stone, "My son never had a memorial, but today I'm touching it for him." Another mother, white, with dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, whispered, "I didn't lose my son to a gun, but to fear. He committed suicide after being interrogated. But I know pain is an army. It marches through every family, no matter the color." And then they stood together, not asking each other's names, not needing an explanation, just looking at the bronze figure of the boy sitting reading a book on the stone, his shoes slightly askew as if preparing to run his hair a little messy, and that gaze that recalled something everyone had once had and lost. Delta Base had once been a closed facility open only to military personnel and special guests. But since the statue of Elijah was built, a small gate in the back opened for civilians. Every weekend, at least several dozen people came. Some brought letters, others brought soil from their hometowns, scattering it around the tree near the stone as a form of offering. Camille never appeared during these visits. She had never stood long in front of her son's memorial, even though she had approved the final engraving. But every weekend, during the lunch break of her training sessions, people would sometimes see Camille pass slowly, eyes straight ahead, back straight, her hand lightly touching a corner of the stone before continuing on. A young soldier, newly enlisted, said that on his first day at the base, his instructor pointed to the statue and said, "Here we learn to fight, but before that, we learn to know who we are protecting." Those words stayed with him more clearly than any shooting drills or marching tactics. For young soldiers like him, the statue was not just a symbol, but a silent ethical map between the real battlefield and the inner battlefield. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night remembering the eyes in the photo of Elijah, the boy shot while holding a phone, a detail that seemed simple, but shifted the balance of life and death in half a second. An internal training program called Code Hayes was also created after the incident. It was a series of discussions for domestic security forces organized by former Delta veterans. The topic wasn't about shooting techniques or arrest procedures, but about controlling awareness in emergency situations, and about seeing the person before seeing the threat. Under the Elijah Memorial Stone, small classes took place quietly each session with just a few people, but after each one, a few more hearts no longer repeated the same mistakes. Though the media had moved on and no longer mentioned Camille Hayes, her legacy and that of the boy who fell in silence continued to spread in ways that needed no shouting. Every hand that touched the stone, every story told over dinner in some family, every soldier taking a step back before pulling the trigger, was proof that loss could be transformed into a foundation. Elijah may not return, but his name, his gaze, and the reason he was killed will forever remain etched as an indelible mark in the memory of a generation. Lost, but never lost. Camille stood in the dusty training yard, the wind blowing sharply like a cut, carrying the scent of sweat, gunpowder, and something from deep in the past. In front of her were 17 women of all ages, some with graying hair, others with headscarves, some still trembling as they held plastic training rifles, but all shared one look: exhaustion, anger, and the longing for something they had never thought they needed to learn: how to survive as a mother of a black child in a society that could pull a trigger because of a shadow. Camille wasn't in uniform, only wearing a black coat buttoned up to her neck, with faint signs of a badge once removed on her shoulder. She didn't need it to command respect. Her voice was enough to make everyone hold their breath. "I couldn't protect my son, but I can teach other mothers not to be helpless." The class had no chairs, no blackboards. Everything was learned through movement. Camille picked up a plastic phone and handed it to the first woman. "This is your child," she said, then shouted, "Raise your hand." The woman froze, confused, looking up at her. Camille didn't blink. They won't wait for you to understand. You have to teach them how to stand, how to look, how to speak. You can't stop the gun, but you can program the child to survive the first 3 seconds. The women around her held their breath. One woman teared up, but still stood tall. Camille moved to another, pointing to her chest pocket. Where are the papers? Why is your child hiding his wallet in the back pocket? That's the easiest place to be suspicious. Every small detail can kill him. No one protested. No one complained. Everyone understood that today's lesson wasn't about fighting. It was about how to live when you are seen as a threat from the moment you step outside. At the edge of the training field, a 12-year-old boy stood with his sister, watching his mother practice the movement of raising her hands and saying loudly, "I have no weapon, I have a child." Camille walked by, placed her hand on the boy's shoulder and said quietly, "Remember this every time your mother goes out because of you. She is fighting without armor." The boy didn't answer, but the soft grip on his shoulder seemed to ingrain that lesson deep within him. The training sessions continued weekly without sign-ups, cameras, or media. Word of mouth was the only form of advertisement. Each week, new people arrived. Some traveled overnight from different states just to listen to Camille speak for an hour. Despite her cold expression, Camille never turned anyone away. She had one simple condition: bring a photo of your child. She needed to know who they were fighting for. One day, a mother brought a photo of her son who had been killed by the police, a case that was never investigated. Camille held the photo up, staring at it for a long time, then said, "We can't live forever in mourning, but we can turn mourning into strategy." And so that day the class was split into groups to learn how to read the police's positioning, how to distinguish between real and fake orders, and how to look directly into the camera to record what could become evidence. A young mother sat down on the floor after class, crying as she held her face. "I never thought I'd have to teach my child this. I just wanted to teach him math." Camille sat down beside her silent for a moment, then said, "Go ahead and teach him math, but add one equation, how to survive with the skin he's in." Camille's class began to grow into a legend within the community without any promotion. The mothers who had once been silent when their children were stopped by police, who had trembled every time they saw a police uniform, now knew how to document everything, how to file complaints following the proper procedures, how to demand evidence from body cameras, and most importantly, they knew they were not alone. Camille never spoke more about the day her son was shot, but every movement she taught, every glance she gave each mother carried with it a truth that needed no words. She had lived through what they feared, and she chose not to bow her head. At the end of one training session, an older mother approached, placing her hand on Camille's chest over her heart, and said, "My daughter was once handcuffed just for walking through a wealthy neighborhood. You may not be able to save your own child, but you are saving many others." Camille pressed her lips together and gave a slight nod. She didn't need applause. What she needed was for children to return home intact. On the wooden board at the entrance to the classroom, the words were deeply carved: "Survival is resistance. Survival is a strategy." This was the only classroom where tears were considered a form of weaponry, not to mourn the past, but to force the present to change. And Camille, the mother who lost her son, the soldier who lost her faith, now stood at the intersection of grief and training, teaching the world the lesson it had forgotten: never underestimate the silence of a woman who has lost everything. Because sometimes that silence is the sound preparing for a longer war than any bullet. Before dawn in the empty yard of the Delta military base, dozens of armored vehicles lined up as if preparing for a special drill. But there were no alarms, no assembly orders, no loudspeakers. Instead, groups of soldiers got off one by one, their uniforms neat. No one smiling, no one speaking loudly. On each of their shoulders was a black armband, and in front of their chests a small rusted shield-shaped insignia, the old model once given only in life-or-death campaigns. Camille Hayes was summoned that morning without prior notice. She wasn't in uniform. She wore a simple shirt, her hair neatly tied back as quietly as the rhythm of breath she had carried since that fateful shot. As she entered the yard, everyone stood. No one clapped, but that silence was as solid as steel. A senior commander approached his graying hair and experienced expression belonging to someone who had once coordinated federal operations. He stared at Camille for a long time before standing at attention. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. Today, we are not awarding medals. Today, we bow our heads to a soldier who survived. No formal ceremony was recorded in the military handbook to describe this moment, but all the soldiers saluted her simultaneously, a gesture reserved only for those who had stared death in the face and returned intact. Camille stood still. She didn't speak. Her hand didn't rise, but her eyes lingered on each face. Some were younger than her son, others had witnessed real war, and now they looked at her as a living testament that pain too could wear armor. A young officer approached, handing her a small wooden box. Inside was a charred piece of the old insignia, the very one that had been found bloodied on the sidewalk. Under the glass, the newly engraved words read, "Commander Camille Hayes." She didn't return with rage. She returned with resolve. She stared at it for a long time before closing the box. The commander nodded and said quietly, "We know who you are." Late, but not too late to bow our heads. A gentle breeze blew across the yard, carrying the scent of sand metal and memories that hadn't fully closed. But in that moment, Camille was no longer the mother who had lost her son, nor the symbol unwittingly raised in the storm. She was called by her name without a headline, without legend. She was Camille Hayes, and each person there had seen her. The ceremony ended quietly, just as it had begun. No one mentioned the pain, no one praised her bravery. Instead, there were nods, silent handshakes, and a path of honor as she left the yard, stretching all the way to the base gates. Camille walked slowly, each step measured as if walking on familiar ground, but this time there was no gunfire, no blood, and no orders forcing her to bow. She hadn't needed to shout in the streets, nor had she resisted with weapons. It was her persistent existence, her silence as hard as steel, and her gaze that had made everyone stand. When she returned to her room, she placed the wooden box on the table next to the old photo of Elijah, smiling broadly in the schoolyard, his hand raised to wave at the camera. Camille sat down, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and slowly wrote, "War is not always fought with guns. Sometimes it's about surviving the wounds without letting them rot you from within." She folded the paper, placed it in the box, and closed it once more. Outside, the world continued its noise, but in that room, in the heart of the woman who had once collapsed beside her son's blood, there was a clear, peaceful rhythm, not because she had forgotten, but because she had overcome. The inscription on her son's gravestone reads, "He taught us all, even in silence." There's no long description, no birth or death dates, no mention of education or achievements. Just that short sentence enough for the thousands who bow their heads before it to understand that some lessons don't need to be spoken, yet still penetrate the minds of those who once ignored the breath of a boy. The grave lies beneath an old oak tree in the military cemetery, a place usually reserved for veterans. But the paperwork was approved within 2 days, and the funeral was held in silence, without honors, without hymns, only the quiet footsteps that stopped at each white grave. Camille came alone. No one dared to intrude on the space around her that morning. She stood before the gravestone for a long time, placing her hand on the inscription. In that moment, she was no longer a commander, no longer a symbol of justice, nor a warrior being honored. She was just a mother standing before an irreplaceable void. On the pale, gray sky, a flock of birds flew by, tearing the silence with the rhythmic flapping of their wings. Camille looked up, her gaze briefly filled with quiet contemplation. No more anger, no more burning fury. But within that stillness there was something that had never faded. It could have been a promise, a deep-rooted torment, or simply a lingering wound from the days torn apart by unjust death. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She only stood there looking at the sky as if searching for something her heart hadn't yet named. Then she walked away slowly without turning back, as though her son were still by her side, as if Elijah had never truly left, only momentarily retreated behind the cloud. The story ends with the image of Camille walking down the stone-paved path leading out of the cemetery, her shadow stretching behind her on the cold stone. It is said that from that day, dozens more people came each month to lay flowers at the small plaque. They left no names wrote. Nothing, simply stood in silence for a few minutes before leaving quietly. Among them were former police officers, veterans, and even mothers who had lost children to gunfire. And when they left, each one would stop at the nearby statue, where Camille's face was carved, holding her son one last time. Her gaze didn't meet the camera, but looked somewhere beyond, as if still searching for a world that refused to wake up. After the incident, no one referred to Camille as a victim with a badge. She never appeared on television, never made a call to action, never wrote a book or gave speeches. But the words she left behind, every silent action, and every unbroken gaze that remained focused on the truth, turned her into a remarkably enduring symbol. People called it power without words. They said Camille Hayes taught an entire generation that justice wasn't just in the law, but in how a person rises after loss, stands tall, and refuses to die a second time, simply because others have yet to open their eyes. Today, at some military schools, when teaching recruits the principle of pulling the trigger, target identification, reaction time, instructors start with the line, "This is a lesson from a mother," a woman who taught us how to survive without losing our humanity. They play an old 42-second clip, the moment Camille knelt beside her son's body, her hands soaked in blood, shouting the first words that would change the nation's consciousness. "You just shot my son. Are you proud of yourselves?" It was no longer a desperate cry. It was a thunderous strike against the artificial order that had long relied on fear to control justice. Camille Hayes in the public eye became something both too close to touch and untouchable. A grieving mother, an unyielding commander, a living witness to an era where even military identity wasn't immune to hasty gunfire. But in herself, Camille probably never thought she was making a revolution. She simply walked through the storm as her survival instinct had carried her through 20 years of service, and in the deepest silence she preserved the most important thing, herself. When asked, has she forgiven, no one knew the answer for sure. Forgiveness isn't something declared in words. It's a state when the heart accepts pain as an inseparable part of life. And in the way Camille looked up at the sky that day, no longer angry, but never letting go, people understood that sometimes the silent existence of a strong woman is the clearest conscience alarm society needs to hear. Elijah may be gone, but the legacy he left through his mother's hands continues to live, as quiet steps that cannot be erased. From that incident, a law named Malik was enacted mandating the public release of body cam footage and the immediate handling of any signs of racial discrimination in law enforcement. The survival resistance training led by Camille for mothers who had lost children to police violence became a space where no one cried out loud, but every punch on the punching bag, every defensive posture, and every word spoken in that class was a way for people to heal without hardening. Elijah, though no longer alive, became the reason for hundreds to rise, for thousands to rethink how they viewed a black child sitting on a doorstep. From this story, the lesson isn't about military victories or medals. It's a lesson in the power of silence at the right moment and action at the right time. It's about how no one has the right to judge another simply because of their skin color stance or the phone in their hand. It's about the responsibility of those in power that power is not meant to pull the trigger, but to protect the fragile boundary between life and misjudgment. Camille Hayes didn't need to give a passionate speech. Her life, the pain she lived through, and the way she moved forward were her most powerful declarations. She didn't break the system, but she made it look in the mirror. She didn't need to win against anyone because she knew not surrendering was the greatest victory in an era full of exhaustion. And finally, when Camille bowed her head before her son's tombstone where the inscription read, "He taught us all." Even in silence, people understood. Some people, even in silence, leave the clearest footprints on the path of change. Elijah is gone, but what he left behind through his mother's eyes will live on for a long time. And Camille, the woman who once trained urban assault teams, taught the world something not found in military manuals: true justice. Sometimes it doesn't need a gun, just a person standing firm amidst the ruins without losing themselves.